Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Show Off Your CI/CD Pipeline. And today I'm joined by Michael. Hey, Michael, great to have you.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And before we get started with your pipeline, let's just get a little bit of an introduction for people that don't know you, right? So we even met in person already, and I even have your microphone, which we just found out, right? Cool to have you on finally. Who are you?
Yeah. Oh, it's been awesome. I'm currently in London right now. I'm out of the country for the first time. But for those that don't know me, the reason why I'm here is because I am a senior developer advocate for AWS. I work on the AppSync team, and I get to travel. And I have a conference coming up tomorrow, CityJS. It'll be over by the time this recording is out. But for those that follow me anywhere online, I go by focusotter, and you can check me out there and stay up to date on all of my latest travel gigs going on.
Yeah, cool. And you actually brought me into the community builders when I started, and that's where I first kind of knew you from as well. So it's a real pleasure for me to have you on today. And fun fact, you're the first Amazonian that I record with, right? So it's gonna be really interesting. First time, usually I try to get real builders, but I think you are one, right?
I'm pretty in the depths. I would say when you think of a developer advocate, I'm definitely skewed more towards the engineering in that mid funnel pipeline. So pun intended for today's episode. But yeah, I would say I like to get in the weeds of the tech, and hopefully I am the first and not the last Amazonian that they let on the podcast.
Yeah, let's see. I already have sessions scheduled with another Amazonian for in a few weeks. But today we're going to look at one of the projects that you have been building and lastly, and that you have been also blogging about a lot. What is it?
Yeah, I am focused currently on helping SaaS companies get set up. In particular, the indie maker, the micro SaaS, and then the traditional larger SaaS applications. We're using front end technologies as well as back end. We're constructing it within the CDK, and as you mentioned, I've been blogging all about it lately, on everything from how do you get your project set up to something like today's episode, which is how do you get it deployed.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And as you know, I'm really focused on CI/CD, and I really want to see how you're deploying the stuff out that you build, right? So I would propose let's just directly start. Let's look at how does the CI/CD pipeline for your project look like, and maybe while we get set up, what is the project about? I think you did not choose a to-do list this time, right?
No, I didn't. I'm being a little bit more ambitious. So it is a full SaaS application that I'm building. We use Stripe for payments, and then the product itself is recipes. So you can sign up, have sort of a scrapbook where you can create recipes, and then we have a paid tier, which allows you to use OpenAI to have a recipe automatically generated for you.
Cool. So this means you're planning your way out of Amazon then, right? Or not yet?
I'm very happy with where I'm at.
Okay, cool. Let's get started. So let's look at the pipeline, and feel free to start sharing your screen, and then we're gonna look at some code, right? That's what I'm really interested in.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and pull this up. Just one moment here. And I'm going to increase the font size just by 1.
Yep.
And then we'll check out the GitHub Actions workflow that I have set up for us today. So as I just gave away, my pipeline is all created and managed through GitHub Actions. Now there's 2 parts to this. So I am saying within this action that whenever a push is made to our develop branch, then go ahead and run your typical CDK diff, CDK deploy setup.
Let's pause a second.
Yeah.
You're the first one that doesn't do, well, it's at the end trunk-based main branch development. You're starting with the develop branch. Why?
Yeah, because for me, when I'm developing, GitHub sets you up on the main branch, and that's great. But I like to keep that as my production branch locally. It's something that I actually never touch. I never really go into my main branch. I immediately go to a develop branch, and then I set up my pipeline and then within GitHub, I set it up so that only the main branch can be merged to. You can never commit directly to it. So I kind of pretend it doesn't exist locally.
Okay, cool. That means the main line is then also the one that actually automatically is going to deploy out.
Absolutely.
And what's the strategy for the develop branch? Is there anything also being deployed from an environment perspective, like a development environment or something like that?
Exactly. I try to keep, so there's two parts to this. The first part is the action, but maybe I should have checked out the other part, which is going to be our context. So then within CDK, you can have your context set up. I choose to have mine in a separate file. But I have two areas. What are the globals that are going to be the same within any develop or production part of my application? And then what are the things that are going to differ? Now, I've just kept this simple, so I removed some things. But I'm essentially saying, hey, the environment for my CDK deployment is going to be develop, and the branch that this is associated with is my develop branch. And then anytime I have environment-specific configurations, like allowed origins or a retain policy on DynamoDB, then I stick those in here.
Cool. That makes sense.
Yep. So then within the CDK stack file, then I just have code set up so that it makes that distinction and it checks, what branch are we on, and it creates one object between our globals and then the specific environment that we're working in. So with that explained, I guess now's a good time to jump back into the action. So on commit, we are going to deploy our CDK project. And this is just checking out the code, doing the diff, and then the actual deployment itself. Now, one of the things that I am working with right now is this bottom area right here. And this is saying if the deployment succeeds, then go ahead and call a webhook for my front end and automatically deploy my front end from there as well.
So this means what I'm seeing here is we have an infrastructure piece in CDK, which is being deployed. Well, it's being diffed at the first stage. Then we have the second stage where we actually deploy it out. But this does not really include application code, or does it?
This, I guess it kind of depends. It deploys my application code, my backend application code. And then on success, it will deploy my front end application code.
Okay, so as part of the CDK deploy, we are then also pushing out backend, which would be Lambda functions and these kind of things. But the front-end pieces is segregated here in a different stage.
In a different stage, but also in a different repo. So I don't combine the two. So in this project, you'll only find my CDK code. And then in a separate repo, I have all of my front-end code. And I do that so that teams can operate independently. But I get the whole debate on monorepo versus polyrepo.
Yeah, and I'm constantly thinking about that myself as well. And the question is, what is right, and what does the team want to work with, right? So I guess in this case, it's just you, most probably, working on this. So you can choose on your own. You kind of break with that last step, right? You break that separation of the repositories, right? Do you have a pipeline that only does the front-end deployment as well?
Yeah, so with this setup, the front end is still able to have their own deployments, and this is optional. So this is something I'm experimenting with to figure out if it is something that we should identify as a practice. But currently, all I'm doing is saying when the backend succeeds, deploy the front end, just so that the two can be in sync, specifically the production branch and the develop branch. But the front end is still able to set up their own deployment pipelines. All this is doing is calling the webhook.
Okay, cool. That webhook is then going to trigger a GitHub action in the other repository.
Absolutely. If we look at my package.json, I have a couple scripts set up. So I'm using just to help backend developers. Again, this is a project that I hope to share out. So using the AWS CLI, we're going to create that webhook. It's going to generate a URL for us. And then that's what we're going to stick into our GitHub pipeline.
Okay, cool. The front end also requires some infrastructure, I would say, I would expect, right? Is this deployed in the other pipeline, or is this deployed in the first step up here?
The front end infrastructure is all managed by Amplify hosting. So for those that may not be familiar, Amplify hosting is a managed service, which allows you to automatically have your deployment pipeline set up through AWS, fully managed by Amplify hosting. So it'll pick up the GitHub repo, and then on commit, it'll do all those changes itself.
Yeah, and that's a very easy possibility, right, to get your front end at the end deployed, right? Luckily, with Code Catalyst blueprints, you also have an easier possibility at the end to set that up on the one side, but also on the other side to deploy out front end to S3 and CloudFront hosting, right? Which I personally like more because you get more flexibility in that terms. But that's my personal preference.
Yeah, the Amplify CLI does give you the ability to post to S3 and CloudFront, but it is only on it's not really a pipeline. It's a manual process. So to your point, something that's really compelling is having something like Code Catalyst where you can have a full pipeline set up.
Yeah, and where we can actually also predefine these steps in the pipeline at the end.
Right.
Okay, cool. So let's go one step back. At the beginning of your you have two stages in that pipeline that we're looking at right now. But this just executes CDK at the end, right? So what does CDK do for you in terms of so line number 24 or whatever, right? Number 23, we could do the CDK diff, and then we do the CDK deploy later. Is there any automation behind those magic commands, right? So what I'm looking at is, where do we run unit tests? Where do we run maybe security scans or security tests?
Yeah, as I'm getting set up with this, I'll admit I'm fairly new to GitHub Actions. So now that I have a good understanding of what a base pipeline looks like, your tests and your security scans would come right in here underneath these. So you name your stages essentially. So here are my steps. I'm going to name checkout repo. You essentially would have another step where you would have a testing step within here. I'm going to run something like npm test to create that staging environment, or that, I guess, pre-deploy environment.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that I also see in talking to other community builders and other people around the globe, is that we don't focus on getting all of that kind of setup at the start, right? Still, if I remember correctly, the CDK deploy is going to mandate that CDK tests are actually executed, right? So, or not?
It doesn't. No. You can deploy without having tests in there. Now, what it does mandate is that a CDK synth happens. So when you deploy, it will synth down to CloudFormation to make sure that at least that part is valid. But in terms of unit tests and integration tests, it doesn't mandate that part.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So what is the size of the architecture that we're deploying, especially the backend part, right? So I think I saw an architecture diagram somewhere. I don't know if you have that available, if we want to just do a quick look at that one.
I don't have it with me, but we can take a look at some of the services that are created.
Cool.
So what we have, again, this is a SaaS application. So we have two tables, one for our users within our SaaS, and this is going to be populated via a post-confirmation Lambda that gets fired whenever a user signs up with Cognito. So we have that. We have the product itself. So I'm trying to keep this generic so that others can modify it a little bit easier. But this is going to be a database that contains all of the related product information, in this case, recipes. And then, as mentioned, we have that create user function. It's going to take in a couple of things, the ARN of the table for permission management, and then environment variables so that it can perform those actions within the code itself. And one thing you'll notice is that all of these are taking two things, the app name and the environment name. And that's so that we can have multi-region deployments very easily as we switch between our develop and our production branch. So it'll create those new resources with the proper environment. It's also useful for tagging as well. Now, because we are integrating payments, I also have another webhook that gets fired off. What's really cool about this one is that it does use the newer feature within Lambda, which are the function URLs. So I'm creating that. It's an unauthorized function URL. It's fully, I guess, secured via the Stripe verification token that gets passed within the header. But we're using that so that way when someone does make a sign up with our application via Stripe, we can change their pricing model within our application from trialing to, on the base plan or the pro plan, etc.
Okay.
And then from there, as mentioned, we have Cognito. We have our SaaS API being on the AppSync team. That is what we're using in this scenario. And then we have images. With it being a recipe application, you can imagine that is very image intensive. So we are using an S3 bucket, which is also configured with a CloudFront distribution in front of it.
Cool.
And that's pretty much the architecture there.
Cool. So I think I kind of have a picture in my mind, and we can add the blog post, related blog post, to the show notes then, that if people are interested. But let's dive a little bit deeper on the AppSync part here, I would propose. In my own experiences with AppSync, right, I've been kind of debating on, do I do one repository for microservices? Do I do multiple repositories? In this case, the GraphQL API or the AppSync API is kind of very small, or is it bigger? Let's look at that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to create all of my GraphQL resolvers, my AppSync resolvers, via JavaScript. So in terms of size, I have a folder here, and then called GraphQL, and inside of that, I have all of my functions. I don't have too many. They're your typical CRUD operations, but just for folks that may be newer to AppSync or haven't seen it since we launched this ability, you no longer have to write VTL. So instead, I can write JavaScript. So I can say, hey, I want to put an item here, set up authorization rules, or in this case, add the owner fields needed, and have my response template right within the same file as well. It's really nice to have, a single code base. What I can say is that very soon, we'll also be launching TypeScript support as well.
Cool.
And that's, definitely due to the community feedback we posted within our RFC. Folks really want TypeScript, and that's going to be a first-class citizen within AppSync.
That's cool. So just on that CDK code, right? We are importing a GraphQL schema here. I know that CDK also exposes the possibility to write AppSync as code at the end, right? And then it generates the schema for you. Why did you choose to write the schema instead of using those CDK functionalities?
Well, I have insider knowledge. No, it's a.
I guess so.
I prefer schema based. I like my schema to be the source of truth. It also works really well with Amplify's code gen. So I'm not using the Amplify CLI to create my application, but I could still use code generation by having a schema to point it to. So that's really the benefit. And then in terms of that insider knowledge, what I can say is that the team does lean more so on schema-based design as opposed to code generation. Both are valid, but that is just what we're seeing on the team based off of what we see in the community.
Yeah, and I've been discussing about that myself. I tried out both, right? And at the end, writing a schema in CDK code is kind of hard, right? And if you actually have different teams working on this, right, then it's easier to have one schema that everyone can talk about, right? Instead of the backend team reading the CDK code and the front-end team then waiting until the CDK and until the AppSync is deployed, right? So that is one of my experiences here with that.
Yeah, having everything listed here, to your point, anyone can come in here and get an idea, what are the operations in terms of mutations and queries that are being created, what's available, instead of diving into the code itself.
Yep. So what mutations or endpoint did you have? I just saw that list of JavaScript files, but I think you have especially the receipt things, right? And then we have some user pieces, right? And now let's say, and this is just making this up, right? We would have one team that is responsible for doing the receipt functionalities, another team that is responsible for doing all of the user management and maybe pricing and tiers and these kind of things, right? How would we today solve the problem of, well, they want to have different repositories and they want to have different infrastructure as code pieces as well? That's not possible with schema-based development, is it?
It is. It's difficult. It's difficult because you end up writing a lot of your own code, so that the schema becomes stitched together at the end. It's not elegant. It's error prone, and it's really undifferentiated heavy lifting on the customer's part. So one thing that the team is very actively working on is having the ability to have AWS AppSync manage the ability to have separate schemas between teams. And we'll do all that joining and validation on our end. That way, to your point, teams can have separate schemas within their own development pipelines, and it'll just come together under one URL.
Ah, okay. So that's cool because I was just looking at that myself, right? I have a project that I've presented at reInvent as well, where I have like 15 backend microservices, right? And they all should. So before migrating to AppSync, I had API gateways and one API gateway, and that one API gateway had then different kind of endpoints, right? And I was able to manage them through CDK. Now, with moving to AppSync, that's not possible anymore, right? So I had an infrastructure for each of those microservices, and that would have been my aim as well with AppSync. So I'm really looking forward to get that possibility at the end.
Yeah, I would say the easiest solution, and I'm using the word easy, wave of hand here, is that similar to what you would do in API Gateway, you would have a bunch of Lambda functions. But as a lot of customers know, one of the benefits of AppSync is that you don't have to have Lambda functions. You can use direct integrations. So to the point, very soon we'll have the ability so that all of that goes away and we'll just take care of it for you.
Well, that's awesome. Great news. So now let's switch back again to the pipeline pieces. So from a from a deployment perspective, we can see one deployment here to one environment. Or do you have multiple environments, or how do you achieve that kind of promotion strategy as part of your pipeline?
Yeah, so because it's with a GitHub action, this single pipeline will deploy to multi-region based off of where that code is being pushed to. So on push to the develop branch, it will go to my develop region. We saw that that's based off of what I have in my CDK context file. And then if I wanted to create another region here, assuming that it was bootstrapped within the CDK, then I would just come up here and then paste this. And then this would be my environment would be production. And then this would be my main branch. So then now on merge, which is based off of what I have here, whenever a pull request is merged into my main branch, this job will get ran again, but then everything will be parameterized based off of my CDK context. Again, everything is noted by that app in region prefix. So it'll be, app name hyphen region, and then it's also hyphen whatever the environment is. So then that way I'll have sort of separate deployments, and it makes it really easy to add in more environments later on, which is another reason why I love this approach. Even though the initial setup might be a lot of work for someone very new to this, once you have I guess your earlier point, once you have this in place, it is one of those things that becomes boilerplate and easy to reuse in future projects.
Yep, that's true. Now, two additional things, and might not be related to code. So there's other options to do pipelines today, right? As an example, CDK has CDK pipelines that actually can also be used to generate GitHub Actions for you. But we also have Code Catalyst as an alternative. Why GitHub Actions? Just because everyone uses it, or just because you wanted to play around with it?
I would say yes, I wanted to play around with it, but in fairness, ChatGPT wrote most of this. The first point though, it's not because everyone uses it, but it's because the audience that I'm targeting uses it. And I think when folks on Twitter and when customers sort of argue about what is the best strategy, I think what gets often lost in that is what is the context that your customers are going to be developing and using this in. So for my case, a full stack SaaS application that is geared towards front-end developers, well, I want to pick something where they already know how to create services with. So TypeScript and CDK became how I constructed the services. And then I wanted a deployment pipeline that was also easy for them to understand because it was with a familiar tool. And that's where GitHub Actions became something where it's YAML, which is not the most front-end friendly language, but it's easily parsable to understand what's happening here. So that was my design decision, as opposed to something like Code Catalyst or CDK pipelines, where you can sort of get bogged down in everything that's going on when you set up that infrastructure from that perspective, a front-end developer.
Yep, that makes perfect sense, and I think it's an obvious choice at the moment, right? Now, I think I covered everything that I wanted to see from the pipeline. So let's stop with screen share, and then I can put you back on spot at the end, and let's do a kind of a wrap up, right? And understand. So from a wrap up perspective, what are the next steps for this application from your perspective? What are you going to do? How are you going to use it?
Yeah, the next steps are that I am very intentfully doing this building out this application in a methodical way, where every time I add a feature, it's because I have an associated blog post that I want to share with someone. So next steps are just getting the blog post out. By the time this recording is out, it'll all be done. But it is the full experience. I have a currently 8-part series out that talks about how do you build out this infrastructure. It talks about each individual step. But I also do want to experiment a little bit more to figure out, is this the best way? I like to do the go down in the deep and break things so that if customers have that, I can have an informed opinion. So one of the things that isn't available currently in this pipeline is rollbacks. So if the deployment fails on the front end, so let's say the back end deployed, it's in production, but then the front end piece failed for whatever reason. I need to be able to roll back my back end so that it's in a stable state. And I have to weigh it, right? So is it worth it to have that ability, or should I be evaluating some of those other tools that have that more easily integrated?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good direction. I think it's also very important to take people and from step-by-step perspective, right? Something that I saw was secrets, right? I think you have some prerequisites for this pipeline and for this code to be executed. I guess that you're also covering that in one of the posts, right?
Absolutely. That post is out today, where you add in your AWS secrets. I'm happy with the post, but at the same time, having a user put in their access key and access ID, as opposed to using SSO, is something that I'm trying to steer customers away from. And so that way SSO can be the default. Going back to, I can't throw everything at somebody who is just trying to get their small project out there and live into the web. So currently, having access keys and access IDs is the best scenario for that particular customer, someone who is newer. But then, of course, as you scale or as you build out something more robust, integrating SSO would be a next logical step.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think based on the amount of blog posts that you have been publishing on this, right, I can see that you follow, something that you said, I think like 1 or 2 years ago in a podcast where you mentioned get it out and then build on top of that, right? First, make sure that you start getting feedback. And I think that's also what is really important. So now the question that I try to ask everyone, this CI/CD pipeline overview thing is number 5 in the series, I believe, or number 6, something like that.
Number 6.
Number 6. Why is it not the first one?
Yeah, good question. In the first blog post, so there's some context there. So for folks that follow the series, in the first blog post, we talk about why you would want to even do this. Why not pick 7 different, $19 a month services and stitch them together? And then we talk about, how do you get this kind of application set up? It's a 10-minute blog post, and coming from their mindset. A customer just wants to get their SaaS out into the world, which means they want to start building stuff. They want to start adding features. They don't, unfortunately, for better or worse, they don't have the mindset of we need to start with a pipeline. It almost comes off as overbearing. They have a goal in mind, and then the very first thing you say to them is, let's do all this infrastructure piece. It's not interesting. It's not attractive to them. Now, we all have the perspective that it should be very first in the way you get set up for success. So I integrate the pipeline itself at the end, but all of the core pieces in terms of making sure that we're set up for success with staged environments, we do that as the very first piece in the blog post. So it's split.
It's split. Yeah. So cool. So that's exactly what I'm trying to point out in most of my conversations, and also the rest of what I do in my channel, right? Is really talk about we should start projects with CI/CD at the beginning, right? And we should really have the value flow first before we actually try to develop like 500 features.
Yeah.
And I know that we're kind of debating around that, but it is really important from my perspective. You want to be able to quickly produce value.
Absolutely.
Cool. So, Michael, anything else that you would like to show besides your projects? Where can people find you online? Are you still on Twitter? Did you move?
We'll see when this recording airs, but as of today, I'm still on Twitter. You can say I'm one of the folks that, because of my role and being out there in the community, I will likely go down with the ship if that's something that happens in the future. But I like to be where the community is. So I'm on Twitter for now. I'm also on YouTube. I blog. I create videos. You can find me pretty much anywhere. And it's all under the name focusotter.
Cool. Thank you so much. And where will we see you live besides London tomorrow? You already have plans for the rest of the year?
I do. So of course is reInvent. But then prior to that, next month, I guess when this podcast airs, I would have been in Seattle, Portland, and Miami.
Cool.
So all within the States, keeping busy. It's conference season, springtime.
Yeah, that's true. And I hope that you enjoy and that you stay safe. So safe travels home. And yeah, thank you so much for showing us your pipeline today. And yeah, looking forward for further collaborations, especially when that AppSync merge thing comes out, right? Then we can build a pipeline that actually does microservice deployments, right? I think that's going to be really important to showcase that part as well.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure being on here. It's always great catching up with you. So I'm thankful for the opportunity.
And see you around. See you soon. Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.
Bye.